Hello, I'm Kent. I am a former wage and hour investigator for the U.S. Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division, and I used to go out and enforce a series of laws, including the Fair Labor Standards Act and other laws such as government contracts and agricultural laws, uh, migrant laws, those sorts of rules. However, primarily I would investigate the Fair Labor Standards Act. So I thought I would make a video regarding my experiences as an investigator, and pretty much primarily just the Fair Labor Standards Act. I think that was 95% or more of the cases we worked. So I thought I'd make some videos regarding my experiences as a wage and hour investigator, and basically what I would do when I went out, what my concerns were, and basically how individuals would deal with me when I went out there. This is not legal advice. This is not me telling anybody how they should comply with the law or how they should deal with investigators. Thought I'd just make some videos discussing my experiences and my thoughts on the agency and the law itself, and just how investigations generally worked with most individuals and with most investigators. So most people have probably never heard of the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. I know I never had prior to working there, which is ironic, I guess. What was is the Wage and Hour Division is the result of law from the early part of the 20th century, which enforced overtime and minimum wage. The Fair Labor Standards Act is the primary law enforced by the Wage and Hour Division. Well, of course, there are the other series of laws they enforce. As I've said, 95% of the law enforced by them is, in fact, the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, with the Fair Labor Standards Act, when a complaint is made, an investigator will come out and look for compliance to see that individuals are paid properly. This is probably the most interaction anybody's ever really had with the federal government, even more so than the IRS, because it's rare for even an IRS individual to go out and visit an establishment. So most people have never had this sort of interaction before. So when people hear federal government, they think it's a big deal, which I always tell people I'm much more afraid of the state government or city government. Federal government really gives me very little concern because the federal government's a very weak system, and it is very hard for the federal government to enforce most of its laws because it does not have a judicial system in place to enforce most violations. There's not really administrative law judges. They do not have a court system like even your local city does. So I always thought even your HOA was a harder organization to deal with than the federal government. So I will be discussing more about that. Thank you. So the first thing people also are wondering after they figured out that the Wage and Hour Division is coming out is, why are they coming out? Well, there are two reasons the Wage and Hour Division comes out. Generally, I guess there are perhaps a few exceptions, but primarily it is a complaint-driven organization, and to a small degree, there are agency-initiated investigations. Now, the agency initiated investigations, those are just hit and miss. They've decided they're going to investigate landscaping companies or painting companies or whatever transport companies this year. So they'll pick 50 out of a hat and say, okay, go look at them and see if they're in compliance. So they really go out there blind, not knowing what there is. Now, the primary method of going out to a company or organization is a complaint by a former employee or perhaps a relative of that employee. Sometimes the employee is still there, but I would say usually what's happened is that somebody has worked there and they've quit, and they were happy to get a lot of extra hours, getting paid straight time while they're there, but now they're leaving and they're wanting to take an extra bite of that pie. Which, of course, is in fact a violation. However, they're happy to get when they're there. Now they're leaving. They decide they want a little more, or now they're bitter about the circumstances. So, complaints, of course, are primary method of going to a business. So, when an investigator shows up, what sort of information do they already have in hand? Generally, what we had when we showed up is we had a complaint given by phone. Many times the individual made the complaint, it's 2 or 3 months old by the time we even get around to it, sometimes much older than that. And we don't even have contact with the complaint anymore. And that was a big problem for us. So I know when I showed up, I would show up and I'd be like, well, I don't have I know basically what they're complaining about. Organizations, they run very similar, whether it's a Fortune 500 or a store. People go in, they clock in, they clock out, they get paid. You get paid every week or two, sometimes once a month. But generally, for the most part, it's kind of obvious what happens. But you really rarely had too much information, and the complainants usually would make a complaint and run. They would frequently not be very supportive. So if you try to contact them, go back to them, and say, hey, give me a little insight, it always kind of was a pain because they then disappear on you. And I always hated that aspect. So all of a sudden you're stuck in front of an employer knowing that they're causing, that they probably have a violation, but not really having a guide there to help you, or somebody saying, hey, look under, under this piece of paper, look in this drawer, here's what you're really looking for. And that was always a real big problem for me, especially in a complex organization. If you're talking a mom and pop store, not too hard. You got 5 employees with, with their payroll and their pay stubs. That's straightforward. The bigger the organization, the more complex the organization, the harder sometimes it could be to really find out what was going on. And especially if you're dealing with something like a landscape organization where people are dealing a lot in cash, people are being paid a lot under the table, and quite frankly, most employees don't even want to talk to the federal government. I found that very hard to deal with, and most investigators do, and is primarily your hope that the individual business intends to comply, that they want to do the right thing. Now, something I always personally hated about the federal government was their inability to prosecute cases. So when you went out there as a wage and hour investigator, it was essentially just you on your own. I mean, really, even your supervisor really didn't support you. So you'd go out there knowing, okay, I have to turn over this case, knowing there's going to be absolutely zero prosecution. There's no administrative law prosecution. This is not a criminal case. It is a civil law you're enforcing. And once you enforce it, it's not going to court. I mean, there is essentially very few cases which ever actually go to court. So with the federal government is primarily concerned with setting precedents, and they're concerned with kind of their image, actually. So they like to prosecute big cases, like $1 million plus of it cases. Even $400,000 is not a big case in their eyes. So If you come back with $100,000, $25,000 in violations, it was basically ignored by the agency. Now, the local agency, yeah, your supervisor, they'll pay attention to it somewhat, but the the actual solicitor's office, the lawyers for the federal government, they couldn't care less. That was just nickels and dimes, and they really weren't interested. Now, what they were interested in, like I said, cases over $1 million, they like cases that give them in the news. So this include child labor. They did investigate child labor, and they would prosecute child labor if they found that. But that was pretty rare to have true child labor. You might have a 17-year-old working a few too many hours or something, but you didn't have real child labor all that often. Now, what they really liked was to find famous people. And seriously, that was what I thought was ridiculous. They loved to find famous people, and they wanted to prosecute a famous person. So if you'd heard of somebody, your chance of being prosecuted, or their chance of being prosecuted, was much greater, because that famous person would get the agency in the news. Also, they like to go after chains. They want to go after big chains because, once again, people have heard of them. They don't want Ma and Pa's chicken store on the corner, which have been open for 4 years and only people within a couple miles even heard of it. They want your big chain, something with 50 locations that everybody's eating at, because that would give them in the news and people would think, uh-oh, don't want to mess with the federal government. It was mostly an image thing, not really a true prosecutorial thing. So essentially, as I've said, I was more concerned with getting a traffic ticket, getting a fine from my HOA, because those people would actually come after you if you didn't pay. They had ways of getting money out of you. The federal government basically would assert a violation, send the wage hour investigator out and say, okay, I found a violation, pay up. And then, it's the investigator and the agency, the investigator and the company, or the small business, or whatever it was. There was no referral to a court system like a traffic ticket. Now, I always thought it was kind of a violation of the spirit of the government and the U.S. Constitution, and the fact that the Wage and Hour Division would try to deprive people of property and their money without providing any sort of trial system. They would have an investigation, and then they would have no sort of true trial or way in which that individual could then dispute the findings. So I always thought, how could you have a system where the accused cannot dispute the findings? An individual all of a sudden is given a bill for $25,000, $50,000. Maybe it's small, like $5,000, or maybe it's huge, $250,000. Then all of a sudden, the individual has no way of really truly disputing it. It's between the wage and hour investigator and that company. And so, with any other sort of law or rule or system, you would say, okay, well, I want my day in court. Well, you don't get that with the wage and hour division. In general, it's possible, but for the most part, it doesn't just happen. If I get a traffic ticket, I get to go to court and talk about it. But if I get a Fair Labor Standards Act violation, now I have to deal with the person who gave me the violation. It'd be like a cop pulls you over, though, like I said, this is not criminal law, it's civil law, but still, it'd be like a cop pulls you over and they'd be like, okay, you have a traffic ticket, give me the $100. And you couldn't say, well, okay, well, I want to go to court. They'd be like, well, no court, give me $100 right now. And here, sign something that say you did wrong and give me $100, and then you can leave. That's effectively the wage and hour division. Now, there is a way to deal with this. There's both a strength and a weakness of the wage and hour division. It was a strength because it sped things up. It was a weakness in that if I'm the investigator and the other side knows nothing's going to court, all they have to do is know that they can just string me along and eventually I'm going to go away, which sadly is the truth. And unless it is a really bad actor, the solicitor's office wasn't going to get involved. And many times, if it was a really bad actor, the solicitor's office wouldn't want to get involved. So that was kind of a sad aspect, I thought, of the wage and hour division. So now knowing that the wage and hour division was a complaint-driven organization, that it really didn't have a system backing it up to prosecute or review any of the findings, this totally drove the way in which you as an investigator tried to find violations. And it kind of made it a sham. You're basically going out there trying to bamboozle these people into thinking that you had a lot of weight behind you. You had the full weight of the federal government behind you, which isn't that much, as it turns out. If anything, I'd say the federal government's kind of a lightweight. So would you go in and you'd hope that the organization wanted to comply? You weren't really wanting to fight with them. You were trying to go in there and be as nice and friendly and hope that they wanted to do the right thing. Because if they wanted to fight you and they didn't want to do the right thing, all of a sudden you had a lot of problems on your hand. And so I'll kind of go into some of my experiences trying to show up at business and finding that they really didn't care that you were there, or they weren't real interested in dealing with you, because that really could cause a whole lot of problems when you are the judge, jury, and executioner, which essentially the investigator is.